The moment my sister looked me straight in the eye and said I wasn't real family enough to attend her wedding, I knew she had no idea what I was capable of discovering about her precious fiancé. I'm speaking to you from my apartment here in Portland, Oregon, where I've spent the last 3 months processing what became the most traumatic family confrontation of my entire life. My name is Sarah, and what I'm about to tell you is a story about family betrayal, hidden secrets, and the moment when everything I thought I knew about the people closest to me came crashing down in the most spectacular way possible. It all started 6 months ago when my half-sister Emma announced her engagement to Derek, a man she'd been dating for barely 8 months. Emma and I share the same father, but we've never been particularly close. She's always made it clear that she considers herself the legitimate daughter, while I'm just the product of Dad's second marriage after her mother passed away. Growing up, I constantly felt like I was walking on eggshells around her, trying to prove I belonged in a family that she seemed determined to remind me wasn't entirely mine. When Emma called to tell me about the engagement, her voice carried that familiar tone of superiority that I'd grown accustomed to over the years. She spoke about Derek like he was some kind of prize she'd won, describing his successful career in finance, his impressive apartment downtown, and how he'd proposed with a ring that cost more than most people make in 6 months. I congratulated her, genuinely happy that she'd found someone who made her feel special. But there was something in her voice that made me feel like she was performing rather than sharing genuine joy. The wedding planning began immediately, and Emma threw herself into it with the intensity of someone planning a royal coronation. She hired the most expensive wedding planner in the city, booked a venue that required a 2-year waiting list, and began shopping for a dress that cost more than my car. Every conversation we had revolved around wedding details, guest lists, and how perfect everything was going to be. I listened patiently, offering support and enthusiasm, even when her demands became increasingly unreasonable. About 3 months into the planning process, Emma started making comments about the guest list. She mentioned how important it was to her that only real family members be present for her special day. At first, I thought she was talking about distant relatives or family friends, but then she started making pointed remarks about how some people might not understand the significance of the event or appreciate the level of sophistication she was trying to achieve. The comments became more frequent and more targeted. During one particularly uncomfortable family dinner at Dad's house, Emma made a joke about how she needed to make sure everyone at the wedding would fit in with Derek's family and friends. She looked directly at me when she said it, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. Dad tried to change the subject, but I could see the tension building. Emma had always been territorial about family events, but this felt different, more calculated. 2 weeks before the wedding, Emma invited me to lunch at an upscale restaurant downtown. I thought she wanted to discuss last-minute details, or perhaps ask me to help with something wedding-related. Instead, she spent the first 20 minutes talking about how stressful wedding planning had been and how important it was for everything to be absolutely perfect. Then she took a deep breath and delivered the blow that would change everything between us. She told me that after careful consideration, she and Derek had decided to keep the wedding small and intimate, limited to immediate family only. When I pointed out that I was immediate family, she shook her head with a patronizing smile. She said that while she cared about me, I wasn't really immediate family in the same way, and that Derek's family might find it confusing to have me there. She explained that it would be better for everyone if I simply wasn't invited, that I would understand once I was older and had my own family. I sat there in stunned silence, watching my half-sister systematically exclude me from one of the most important days of her life. The casual cruelty of it took my breath away. She wasn't just uninviting me from her wedding. She was telling me that I didn't belong in the family I'd grown up believing was mine. When I tried to argue to point out how hurtful this was, she simply shrugged and said that sometimes difficult decisions had to be made for the greater good. That night, I called Dad in tears, expecting him to be as outraged as I was. Instead, he sounded tired and defeated. He told me that Emma had already spoken to him, that she'd convinced him this was what was best for family harmony. He said he didn't want to cause problems so close to the wedding, that maybe it would be better if I just went along with Emma's wishes this time. The betrayal I felt from Emma was nothing compared to the devastation of realizing that Dad was going to let her push me out without a fight. For the next week, I was consumed with anger and hurt. I couldn't concentrate at work, couldn't sleep, couldn't stop thinking about how easily I'd been discarded by the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. I considered just accepting the situation, maybe sending a gift and pretending everything was fine. But something inside me refused to let Emma win so easily. If she wanted to play games about who belonged in this family, then maybe it was time. She learned that actions have consequences. That's when I decided to do some research on Derek. I told myself I was just curious about the man my sister was marrying. But deep down, I think I was looking for something, anything, that would give Emmy leverage in this situation. I started with basic internet searches, looking through his social media profiles, reading about his work, trying to get a sense of who he really was beyond Emma's glowing descriptions. At first, everything seemed perfectly normal. Derek's LinkedIn profile showed a successful career trajectory. His Instagram was filled with pictures of him and Emma looking happy together. And his Facebook page painted the picture of a well-rounded guy with diverse interests. But as I dug deeper, I started noticing inconsistencies. Small things at first, like gaps in his employment history that didn't quite add up, or references to places he'd lived that didn't match what Emma had told me about his background. The more I investigated, the more questions I had. Derek claimed to have graduated from a prestigious business school, but when I checked the alumni directory, his name wasn't listed. He talked about working for a major investment firm, but when I looked up the company, I couldn't find any record of him in their employee listings. These could have been innocent mistakes or privacy settings, but something about the pattern made me uncomfortable. I decided to hire a private investigator. I know it sounds extreme, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I contacted a woman named Lisa who specialized in background checks, and I asked her to do a comprehensive investigation into Derek's history. I told myself I was protecting my family, that if Derek was hiding something significant, Emma deserved to know before she married him. Lisa called me 3 days later with results that made my blood run cold. Derek wasn't who he claimed to be. His real name was David Richardson, and he had a history of financial fraud that included embezzling money from previous employers and running elaborate schemes to defraud investors. He'd been arrested twice. In other states, though he'd managed to avoid serious jail time through plea deals and restitution payments. Most shocking of all, he was still married to a woman named Jennifer in Arizona, making his upcoming marriage to Emma not just morally questionable, but legally impossible. The man my sister was planning to marry in less than a week was a bigamist and a con artist who had been systematically lying to her about every aspect of his identity. Lisa had documentation proving everything: court records, arrest reports, marriage certificates, and employment records that painted a picture of a man who made his living by deceiving people who trusted him. I spent that entire night staring at the evidence spread across my kitchen table, trying to decide what to do with this information. Part of me wanted to call Emma immediately to warn her about what she was walking into. But another part of me, the part that was still hurt and angry about being excluded from her wedding, wanted to use this information strategically. Emma, had made it clear that I wasn't family enough to matter. Maybe it was time to show her exactly how much I could matter when I wanted to. I decided to attend the wedding anyway. I knew where it was being held. I knew what time the ceremony was scheduled, and I had every detail I needed, thanks to months of Emma's constant wedding talk. I went shopping for the most appropriate dress I could find, something that would make me look respectable and serious when I delivered the news that would change everything that the morning of the wedding. I woke up with a mixture of nervousness and determination coursing through my veins. I kept thinking about Emma's words, about how I wasn't real family, about how Derek's relatives might find my presence confusing. By the time I was dressed and ready to go, I had convinced myself that what I was about to do was not revenge, but protection. Emma might not consider me real family, but that didn't mean I was going to stand by and watch her make the biggest mistake of her life. The wedding venue was everything Emma had described and more. Rolling hills, perfectly manicured gardens, and a chapel that looked like something out of a fairy tale. Cars were lined up along the circular driveway, and I could see guests in their formal attire making their way toward the ceremony space. I parked at the far end of the lot and sat in my car for several minutes, going over what I was going to say and trying to calm my racing heart. As I walked toward the chapel, I could hear the soft murmur of conversation and the gentle melody of string music drifting through the air. Emma had achieved her dream of a perfect wedding setting. Everything looked exactly like the Pinterest boards she'd been showing me for months. I slipped into the back of the chapel just as the processional music began, taking a seat in the last row where I could see everything but hopefully remain unnoticed until the right moment. Emma looked absolutely stunning as she walked down the aisle. Her dress was a masterpiece of lace and silk, her hair was styled to perfection, and her smile was radiant as she approached the altar where Derek waited. For a moment, I almost lost my resolve. She looked so happy, so completely convinced that she was about to begin the perfect life with the perfect man. But then I remembered his real name, his criminal history, and the wife he already had in Arizona, and my determination returned stronger than ever. The ceremony began with traditional vows and readings. Derek played his part perfectly, looking handsome and sincere as he promised to love and cherish Emma for the rest of their lives. If I hadn't known the truth about his identity, I might have been convinced by his performance. He had the acting skills of someone who had spent years perfecting the art of deception, and he was using every bit of that talent to convince a chapel full of people that he was a man worthy of their trust and respect. When the officiant reached the part about speaking now or forever holding their peace, the chapel fell into expectant silence. This was the moment I had been waiting for. The moment when Emma would learn that family isn't just about blood relations, but about people who care enough to protect you from making life-altering mistakes. I stood up slowly, feeling every eye, and the chapel turned toward me. The gasp that went through the crowd was audible, but nothing compared to the look of shock and fury that crossed Emma's face when she saw me standing there. Dad's expression was one of confusion and panic, while Derek looked like a deer caught in headlights. I took a deep breath and began to speak, my voice carrying clearly through the silent chapel. I told them that I had information about Derek that Emma needed to hear before she could legally marry him. I explained that Derek wasn't who he claimed to be, that his real name was David Richardson, and that he was already married to another woman. I pulled out copies of the documentation Lisa had provided, holding them up so everyone could see that I wasn't making wild accusations but presenting verifiable facts. The chaos that followed was unlike anything I had ever witnessed. Emma started screaming at me, calling me jealous and vindictive, demanding that I leave immediately. Derek tried to deny my claims, but his protest sounded weak and unconvincing in the face of the evidence I was presenting. Several of his groomsmen moved toward me, but Dad stepped between us, his face pale but determined as he asked to see the documents I was holding. As Dad examined the marriage certificate showing Derek's existing marriage to Jennifer Richardson, the blood drained from his face. He looked at Derek with an expression of disgust and betrayal, then turned to Emma and gently took her arm. The fight seemed to go out of her all at once as the reality of the situation began to sink in. She looked at Derek, searching his face for some sign that this was all a terrible mistake, but his guilt was written clearly in his expression. Derek made one last attempt to salvage the situation, claiming that his marriage to Jennifer was over in everything but paperwork, that he had been planning to get divorced before marrying Emma, that when I mentioned his history of financial fraud and his outstanding warrants in 2 other states, he seemed to realize that his carefully constructed facade was crumbling beyond repair. He looked around the chapel at the faces staring back at him with a mixture of shock, anger, and disgust, then turned and walked quickly toward the exit. Emma stood at the altar in her perfect dress, surrounded by the remains of her perfect wedding, as the man she thought she was going to marry disappeared from her life as suddenly as he had entered it. The guests began to murmur among themselves, some pulling out their phones to Google Derek's real name, others simply sitting in stunned silence as they processed what they had just witnessed. I approached Emma cautiously, expecting her to lash out at me again, but instead, she collapsed into sobs. All the fight had gone out of her, replaced by the devastating realization that the man she loved had been lying to her about everything from the very beginning. Dad put his arms around both of us, and for the first time in years, I felt like we were actually a family dealing with a crisis together rather than enemies fighting over territory. The aftermath of that day was complicated and emotionally exhausting for everyone involved. Emma had to deal with the humiliation of a very public wedding disaster, the financial loss of deposits and expenses that couldn't be recovered, and the emotional trauma of discovering that someone she trusted had been systematically deceiving her. Dad had to grapple with the fact that he had almost allowed his daughter to marry a criminal because he was afraid of family conflict. As for Derek, or David as we learned was his real name, he disappeared completely after leaving the chapel. Lisa later told me that he had a pattern of moving to new cities and creating new identities when his previous schemes fell apart. Emma filed a police report, but given his history of evading law enforcement, it was unlikely he would ever face consequences for what he had done to her dot in the weeks that followed the wedding disaster. Emma and I had several long conversations about family, trust, and what it means to belong to each other. She apologized for trying to exclude me from her wedding, admitting that she had always felt insecure about sharing Dad's attention and had used our different mothers as an excuse to make herself feel more important. She acknowledged that if I hadn't been there to reveal the truth about Derek, she would have entered into a marriage that could have destroyed her, financially and emotionally. Dad also made an effort to address the family dynamics that had allowed the situation to escalate so far. He admitted that he had been conflict avoidant when it came to mediating between Emma and me, often taking the path of least resistance rather than standing up for what was right. He promised to be more intentional about treating us as equals and making sure that both of his daughters felt valued and protected. The experience taught me something important about the difference between being petty and being protective. When I first discovered Derek's true identity, I was motivated partly by hurt and anger over being excluded from Emma's wedding. But ultimately, what drove me to act was the realization that someone I cared about was in danger, regardless of how she had treated me. Family isn't just about who shares your DNA. It's about who shows up when it matters, even when the circumstances are uncomfortable or complicated. Emma never did get married that year, but she did start dating again eventually. She's much more cautious now about getting involved with people, and she always runs potential partners by family members before